When Miss Lottie's house came into view, we stopped, ostensibly to plan our strategy, but actually to reinforce our courage. Ostensibly means seemingly to plan our strategy, or it seemed like that's what we were going to do, but really something else. Miss Lottie's house was the most ramshackle of all ramshackle homes. The sun and rain had long since faded its rickety frame siding from white to sullen gray. The boards themselves seemed to remain upright, not from being nailed together, but rather from leaning together like a house that a child might have constructed from cards. A brisk wind might have blown it down, and the fact that it was still standing implied a kind of enchantment that was stronger than the elements. There it stood, and as far as I know, is standing yet. A gray, rotting thing with no porch, no shutters, no steps, set on a cramped lot with no grass, not even any weeds, a monument to decay. You should ask yourself, what does this description of Miss Lottie's home add to your understanding of her and her social financial standing? In front of the house, in a squeaky rocking chair, sat Miss Lottie's son, John Burke, completing the impression of decay. John Burke was what was known as queer headed. Black and ageless, he sat, rocking day in and day out in a mindless stupor, lulled by the monotonous squeak squawk of the chair. A battered hat atop his shaggy head shaded him from the sun. Usually, John Burke was totally unaware of everything outside his quiet dream world, but if you disturbed him, if you intruded upon his fantasies, he would become enraged, strike at you, and curse at you in some strange enchanted language which only he could understand. We children made a game of thinking of ways to disturb John Burke and then to elude his violent retribution. Retribution means something given in repayment, usually as a punishment. But our real fun and our real fear lay in Miss Lottie herself. Miss Lottie seemed to be at least 100 years old. Her big frame still held traces of the tall, powerful woman she must have been in youth, although it was now bent and drawn. Her smooth skin was a dark reddish brown, and her face had Indian-like features and the stern stoicism that one associates with Indian faces. Stoicism, indifference to pleasure or pain, lack of visible emotion. So doesn't her face didn't seem like it had any emotion. Miss Lottie didn't like intruders either, especially children. She never left her yard and nobody ever visited her. We never knew how she managed those necessities that depend on human interaction, how she ate, for example, or even whether she ate. When we were tiny children, we thought Miss Lottie was a witch, and we made up tales that we half believed ourselves about her exploits. We are far too sophisticated now, of course, to believe that witch nonsense, but old fears have a way of clinging like cobwebs, and so when we sighted the tumble-down shack, we had to stop to reinforce our nerves. Look, there she is, I whispered, forgetting that Miss Lottie could not possibly have heard me from that distance. She's fooling with them crazy flowers. Yeah, look at her. Miss Lottie's marigolds were perhaps the strangest part of the picture. Certainly they did not fit in with the crumbling decay of the rest of her yard. Beyond the dusty brown yard, in front of the sorry gray house, rose suddenly and shockingly a dazzling strip of bright blossoms, clumped together in enormous mounds, warm and passionate and sun-golden. The old black witch woman worked on them all summer, every summer, down on her creaky knees, weeding and cultivating and arranging while the house crumbled and John Burke rocked. For some perverse reason, we children hated those marigolds. They interfered with the perfect ugliness of the place. They were too beautiful. They said too much that we could not understand. They did not make sense. There was something in the vigor with which the old woman destroyed the weeds that intimidated us. It should have been a comical sight. The old woman with the man's hat on her cropped white head, leaning over the bright mounds, her big backside in the air. But it wasn't comical. It was something we could not name. We had to annoy her by whizzing a pebble into her flowers or by yelling a dirty word, then dancing away from her rage, reveling in our youth and mocking her age. Actually, I think it was the flowers we wanted to destroy, but nobody had the nerve to try it, not even Joey, who was usually fool enough to try anything. I'm going to go back to perverse. Perverse means stubbornly contrary, wrong, or harmful, so it's shameful. Y'all get some stones, commanded Joey now, and was met with instant giggling obedience as everyone except me began to gather pebbles from the dusty ground. Come on, Lisbeth. I just stood there peering through the bushes, torn between wanting to join the fun and feeling that it was all a bit silly. You scared, Lisbeth? I cursed and I spat on the ground, my favorite gesture of phony bravado. Bravado is a false show of courage or defiance, so it's false. Y'all children get the stones. I'll show you how to use them. I said before that we children were not consciously aware of how thick were the bars of our cage. I wonder now, though, whether we were not more aware of it than I thought. Perhaps we had some dim notion of what we were and how little chance we had of being anything else. Otherwise, why would we have been so preoccupied with destruction? Anyway, the pebbles were collected quickly, and everybody looked at me to begin the fun. Come on, y'all. We crept on the edge of the bushes that bordered the narrow road in front of Miss Lottie's place. She was working placidly, kneeling over the flowers. Her dark hand plunged into the golden mound. Suddenly, zing! An expertly aimed stone cut the head off of one of the blossoms. Who out there? Miss Lottie's backside came down and her head came up as sharp as her eyes searched the bushes. You better get. We had crouched down out of sight in the bushes, where we stifled the giggles that insisted on coming. Miss Lottie gazed warily across the road for a moment, then cautiously returned to her weeding. Zing! Joey sent a pebble into the blooms, and another marigold was beheaded. Miss Lottie was enraged now. She began struggling to her feet, leaning on a rickety cane and shouting, Y'all go on home. Then the rest of the kids let loose with their pebbles, storming the flowers and laughing wildly and senselessly at Miss Lottie's impotent rage. Impotent means powerless, lacking strength or vigor. So she was angry, but didn't really mean anything. She shook her stick at us and started shakily toward the road, crying, Get along, John Burke. John Burke, come help. Then I lost my head entirely, mad with the power of inciting such rage, and ran out of the bushes into the storm of pebbles, straight toward Miss Lottie, chanting madly, Old witch fell in a ditch, picked up a penny, and thought she was rich. The children screamed with delight, dropped their pebbles, and joined the crazy dance, swarming around Miss Lottie like bees and chanting, Old lady witch, while she screamed curses at us. The madness lasted only a moment, for John Burke, startled at last, lurched out of his chair, and we dashed for the bushes just as Miss Lottie's cane went whizzing at my head. I did not join the merriment when the kids gathered again under the oak in our bare yard. Suddenly I was ashamed, and I did not like being ashamed. The child in me sulked, and said it was all in fun, but the woman in me flinched at the thought of the malicious attack that I had led. The mood lasted all afternoon. When we ate the beans and rice that was supper that night, I did not notice my father's silence, for he was always silent these days. Nor did I notice my mother's absence, for she always worked until well into the evening. Joey and I had a particularly bitter argument after supper. His exuberance got on my nerves. Finally, I stretched out upon the pallet in the room we shared and fell into a fitful doze. Exuberance means a condition of unrestrained joy. When I awoke somewhere in the middle of the night, my mother had returned, and I vaguely listened to the conversation that was audible through the thin walls that separated our rooms. At first I heard no words, only voices. My mother's voice was like a cool, dark room in summer, peaceful, soothing, quiet. I loved to listen to it. It made things seem all right somehow. But my father's voice cut through hers, shattering the peace. 22 years, Maybelle, 22 years, he was saying. I got nothing for you, nothing, nothing. It's all right, honey, you'll get something. Everybody's out of work now. You know that. It ain't right. Ain't no man ought to eat his woman's food year in and out and see his children running wild. Ain't nothing right about that. Honey, you took good care of us when you had it. Ain't nobody got nothing nowadays. I ain't talking about nobody else. I'm talking about me. God knows I tried. My mother said something I could not hear. My father cried out louder. What must a man do? Tell me that. Look, we ain't starving. I get paid every week, and Mrs. Ellis is real nice about giving me things. She gonna let me have Mr. Ellis's old coat for you this winter. Darn Mr. Ellis's coat, and darn his money. You think I want white folks leavin's? Darn, Maybelle. And suddenly he sobbed, loudly and painfully, and cried helplessly and hopelessly in the dark night. I had never heard a man cry before. I did not know men ever cried. I covered my ears with my hands, but I could not cut off the sound of my father's harsh, painful, despairing sobs. My father was a strong man who would whisk a child upon his shoulders and go singing through the house. My father whittled toys for us and laughed so loud that the great oak seemed to laugh with him, and taught us how to fish and hunt rabbits. How could it be that my father was crying? But the sobs went on, unstifled, finally quieting until I could hear my mother's voice, deep and rich, humming softly as she used to hum to a frightened child. The world had lost its boundary lines. My mother, who was small and soft, was now the strength of the family. My father, who was the rock on which the family had been built, was sobbing like the tiniest child. Everything was suddenly out of tune, like a broken accordion. Where did I fit into this crazy picture? I do not now remember my thoughts, only a feeling of great bewilderment and fear.